speaker series. And today's a very special episode. Not only is it Halloween, but it is our first book launch episode for the Cinema Chat series. Just some quick introductions. I'm Christina Santos, the host. We have Morgan Crosby, who will be moderating our live stream. And to our viewers, we will be saving questions till the end of the presentation, but you can go ahead and type in your questions in the chat bar as our guest speaker is presenting. And we will open it up to questions at the end. So without further ado, a brief introduction to our guest speaker today, Dr. Kevin McGuiness. He's a professor of art history for the School of Academic and Liberal Studies at Niagara College in Ontario, Canada. He completed his PhD in interdisciplinary humanities at Brock University, and whom I had the privilege to supervise. And it's coming out of that thesis that we have his book today, The Cinematic Boogeyman, From Fairytale to the Slasher Film. His previous education includes a master's degree in studies in comparative literature and arts, as well as an honors BA in visual arts. He has also obtained a postgraduate diploma from the Interactive Multimedia program at Niagara College, where he has trained in a myriad of technical and creative computer programs. His publications include contributing a chapter to the Compendium Virgin Envy, released by University of Regina Press, as well as articles in Eugesta Journal on Gender Studies in Antiquity and Monsters and Monstrous. And without further ado, I will pass the word on to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. And I wanted to just say a little thanks to both of you. I want to thank Christina for organizing this event on Cinema Chat, as well as serving as my mentor during my time as a graduate student. As Christina previously mentioned, my book, The Cinematic Boogeyman, which I'm going to be discussing today, is actually based on my PhD thesis, which I wrote under Christina's supervision, and would not have been possible without her guidance. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Morgan, who's monitoring the chat group during this event and has graciously donated her time to this event. And finally, I wanted to express my appreciation for the visitors who have dropped by today. Hopefully it is an enjoyable and entertaining experience. But the way this is basically going to function is that I am going to basically deliver a very brief introduction, just a few minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, that outlines the overall thesis, the argument of the book. And then I'm going to show a pre-recorded video titled Death in the Maiden, which essentially summarizes the 4th chapter, and I think the most interesting section of the book. So without further ado, let's begin. On the eve of Halloween in a sleepy Midwest town, 6 shots ring out in the night sky like the tolls of a bell. With his revolver still drawn, Dr. Loomis stares down from the balcony at the masked intruder, Michael Myers, who lies lifeless on the suburban lawn below. Beside him, a young woman, Laurie Strode, covers her face and her open wounds stain her clothing red with blood. As the gun smoke clears, she whispers to herself in astonishment, it was the Boogeyman. This riveting scene at the climax of John Carpenter's 1978 horror film classic Halloween has thrilled audiences since its debut. But the question begs to be answered, what is it about Michael Myers that reminds Laurie Strode of the monstrous boogeyman from fairy tales? Perhaps it is due to the fact that Myers is a grim specter that comes in the night to harm his victims and can vanish at will. Like the villains of folklore, Michael is elusive and enigmatic, and his haunting image fills us with dread. He operates just beyond the reach of our conscious minds in the realms of dreams and nightmares. Indeed, the boogeyman is a complicated figure to examine due to the fact that he is known by many names all over the globe. Appearing throughout the ages in paintings, myths, fairy tales, and more recently, horror movies, what we're going to be discussing today. It is my belief that not only Myers, but also many other antagonists that populate the slasher subgenre from the 1970s and early 80s are cinematic manifestations of the folkloric boogeyman. These popular killers are the successors of the monsters of fairy tales and preserve a tradition of villainy that dates back to the pre-modern world. Although there has been considerable material published about the social and political facets of the slasher subgenre, there is little scholarship that addresses how these movies fit within a broader historical context. Underlying the writings of many contemporary film theorists is the assumption that cinematic works have little in common with earlier forms of storytelling. The goal of this presentation is to move beyond this preconception and examine the aesthetic components of the slasher in relation to the fairy tale. Thus, rather than focusing on the technical properties of these films, my analysis is predominantly concerned with the narratological facets of these productions that are similarly present in the fairy tale. In terms of methodology, this presentation uses the practice of archetypal criticism to assess the boogeyman and ascertain the specific attributes that define this frightening and mysterious character. This structure represents the most effective route to examine artistic works from disparate geographical and temporal contexts. Consequently, much of the theoretical framework employed in my investigation is derived from Carl Jung and his notion of the collective unconscious, a reservoir located in the deepest recesses of the mind that houses a set of archetypal forms inherent to all persons. The archetype is developed through personal experiences, and it evolves into images which emerge in the conscious mind and are eventually manifested in popular narratives. Representations of archetypal forms may vary according to sociological conditions. However, they ultimately express universal ideas. Merging Jung's writings with research from the fields of philosophy, feminism, and film studies, I investigate the boogeyman and his ominous presence in Western culture. Looking at the traits that underpin his persona, I argue that he is a composite of three specific archetypes: the collective shadow, the terrible father, and the death demon. These forms merge to create a mythical monster that expresses innate anxieties related to punishment, pain, sin, and suffering. Firstly, he embodies the role of the collective shadow and functions to personify violent and anarchic impulses that are repressed by the public and projected onto maligned figures in the popular consciousness. Secondly, he is a manifestation of the negative attributes associated with the archetypal father, referred to in literature as the terrible father, who punishes individuals that defy communal values. Finally, he is a cultural embodiment of the death demon, a conceptual figure that signifies the existential terror related to death and the degeneration of the body. Due to the fact that he expresses fears that are foundational to the human condition, the boogeyman is an instrument of personal psychic growth. Thus, his presence allows the individual to transfer their innermost dread onto an external agent that can be hunted down and, at least temporarily, destroyed. Through this interaction, the subject is able to achieve catharsis and gain entry into adulthood, as well as the tools necessary for emotional maturity. After determining the archetypal properties of the folkloric boogeyman, I highlight the presence of these same qualities in specific popular villains from the American slasher films of the 1970s and 80s. Within these movies, we see the rise of a particular type of antagonist, a masked male killer who imposes horrific punishment upon younger cast members for engaging in illicit acts. These characters include Michael Myers from Halloween, Jason Voorhees of Friday the 13th, and of course, Freddy Krueger, featured in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Through my evaluation of these gruesome figures, I situate them within a larger narratological context and simultaneously establish their role as cinematic manifestations of the folkloric boogeyman. The video which I am about to show you in a moment is a summary of the fourth chapter of my book and outlines how the cinematic boogeyman serves as a personification of death and is diametrically opposed to the heroine, who represents the conflicting forces of life within the structure of the slasher film. I shall now begin the video. A young virginal heroine is stalked and eventually attacked by a psychopathic killer in a moment of destructive eroticism.
This is the disturbing scene depicted at the climax of almost every slasher film. In this presentation, I will examine two of the most widely recognized films in this subgenre, Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street, through a psychoanalytic lens in order to better understand the emotional and symbolic significance of this violent exchange between the protagonist and villain. Specifically, I will analyze these films in the light of Jungian scholar Erich Neumann's text, Amor and Psyche, in which he proposed that during the development of the feminine psyche, the subject must undergo a rite of passage called the marriage to death. During this stage of development, the individual is either literally or symbolically wed to death, embodied by a monstrous villain, and must confront this figure in order to attain psychological maturity. This encounter with death symbolically expresses the act of sexual intercourse and is necessary for the subject to cross the threshold into adulthood. Neumann goes on to state that the marriage to death theme is a common narrative trope that is featured in myths, tales, and other cultural texts. In my research, I propose that this theme is dramatized in the slasher film through the violent confrontation between the final girl and the killer. Though the heroines in these films are not literally married to their villainous counterparts, they share a sexually charged relationship rooted in repression and express their libidinal impulses through the violence they perpetrate against one another. It is through her intelligence and wit that the slasher heroine is able to confront and overcome death to successfully reach the state of individuation and become a fully realized adult. Neumann was a German-born Israeli philosopher and psychologist who wrote extensively on the role of archetypes in art, religion, and myth. His most notable works include The Origins and History of Consciousness, The Great Mother, and Amor and Psyche, all of which address the arduous process that the human psyche undergoes during maturation. He was one of Jung's closest intellectual allies and essentially functioned as his protege, carrying on his work concerning parental archetypes in psychological development. In Amor and Psyche, he uses Greco-Roman mythology to outline the 5 stages involved in the development of the feminine psyche, which includes the introduction, the marriage to death, the act, the 4 tasks, and the happy ending. In his analysis of the marriage to death, Neumann characterizes this phase as a symbolic articulation of the physical act of intercourse, as experienced by the subject. He describes this event as a rite of passage that marks the individual's transition into adulthood and is often experienced metaphorically as a terrifying act of sacrifice in which the subject is offered up to a monster, dragon, wizard, or evil spirit. In such narratives, the villain threatens to arrest the psychological development of the female protagonist, and consequently she must confront and overcome him in order to reach maturity. Such stories feature a female protagonist who is either literally or metaphorically wed to a death-like male figure, and must uncover the truth about her adversary in order to escape his fatal grip. By surviving her encounter with this monster, the heroine reaches a new level of consciousness and fulfills her psychological potential. Within the framework of the slasher film, we see this dynamic occur between the heroine and the villain. The female protagonist is faced with the responsibility of subduing or conquering the figure of death that is manifested in the form of a masked or disfigured villain. In these narratives, sexual impulses are sublimated into violence, and the act of killing is transformed into the perverted expression of the villain's masculine sexual energy. At the climax of the slasher film, the heroine encounters the personification of death and must overcome her shock and fear in order to end his destructive reign. As Carol Clover points out, it is the final girl who looks death in the face and possesses the integrity and courage to overcome him in the final act of the film. Through the process of waging battle with the villain, the female protagonist undergoes a process of maturation that marks her transformation into adulthood. Developing the rational facets of her psyche, she must master the art of logos in order to develop a strategy to surmount her adversary's attacks and conquer him. This rite of passage is accompanied by the revelation of a strange kinship that she shares with the villain and binds the two of them together on a psychological level. This relationship is either explicitly acknowledged within the narrative or revealed symbolically through the aesthetic structure of the film. This motif is most readily observed in Halloween, as an intense psychological bond between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers is established through the use of subjective camera work. Similarly, Nancy Thompson of A Nightmare on Elm Street shares a disturbing connection with Freddy Krueger due to the fact that her parents took an active role in his death by immolation. These explicit links between heroine and villain serve to symbolically highlight their archetypal compatibility in the film's narrative. The final girl and the killer embody opposing psychological principles and are therefore ideal adversaries, as their encounter at the conclusion of the film resolves the tension that is built throughout the narrative. Despite their differences, both the heroine and villain in the slasher film frequently exhibit the quality of sexual frustration that is expressed through the violence that they perpetrate against one another. The sublimation of the heroine's sexuality into acts of aggression allows her to appropriate and manipulate the killer's weapons. This quality of the final girl also results in a bizarre kinship with the villain, as he similarly exhibits a repressed and/or sublimated sexual drive. Their savage interactions are consequently transformed into expressions of libidinal energy, and the prospect of death becomes a metaphor for the consummation of the sexual facets of their relationship. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this notion is presented through the violent clashes between the characters of Michael Myers and Laurie Strode in John Carpenter's Halloween. Throughout the course of the film, it is insinuated that Laurie and Michael share a unique relationship rooted in sexual repression. Both heroine and villain have sublimated their energies into alternate activities, resulting in Michael's preoccupation with violent acts of destruction and Laurie's fixation on her schoolwork and other responsibilities. This quality is noted in both characters by John Carpenter, who described the film as the revenge of the repressed. Similarly, Kendall Phillips points out that both Michael and Laurie are sexual misfits with stunted and immature libidinal drives, a fact which explains why they are presented as mirror opposites in the film. However, their contradictory natures are what paradoxically bind Laurie and Michael together, as they are united through their symbolic opposition to one another, representing the conflicting forces of life and death. Within the microcosm of the film, it is repeatedly suggested that these two antithetical characters are fated to meet and are perfectly matched to wage battle, permitting them an opportunity to externalize their sexual energy through a series of violent confrontations. In a perverse twist, Laurie and Michael are posited as bizarre lovers in the narrative structure of Halloween, bound together by their mutual plight of sexual frustration. This notion is established early in the film, when Laurie is asked by her father, a real estate agent, to leave a key under the mat of the Myers house so he can show it to prospective buyers. Unbeknownst to Laurie, as she walks onto the Myers property, she is being watched by Michael from inside the house, and upon catching sight of this young woman trespassing on his property, he becomes instantly fixated on her. Through the screen door of the Myers house, the camera captures Michael's silhouette rising from the shadows as Laurie walks up the front steps of the porch to drop off the key. The over-the-shoulder camera shot of Myers places Laurie and him in the same visual space and forces the viewer to witness the heroine through his desirous eyes. As the scene continues, Laurie begins her journey to school, humming a lullaby to herself that features the lyrics, "I wish I had you all alone, just the two of us," all the while oblivious to the fact that Michael continues to watch her. Again, Carpenter utilizes an over-the-shoulder shot of Michael on the sidewalk outside the Myers home as Laurie walks away, thereby hinting at a sexual connection between these two characters. This reading of Carpenter's direction is supported by the fact that in the soundtrack to the scene, the audience can hear Laurie's singing, overlaid with the unsettling and almost sensuous sound of Michael's heavy breathing. This sequence insinuates that Myers is the fulfillment of Laurie's repressed desire to have a boyfriend, and establishes a disturbing link between the two characters. In a later scene, it is further suggested that Laurie and Michael not only share a psychosexual connection, but their eventual encounter at the conclusion of the film has been preordained. As Laurie sits in class, listening to her teacher discuss the concept of fate in relation to the text The Life of Collins by moralist Samuel Johnson, she glances out the window and catches sight of Myers on the street, returning her stare. Carpenter's choice of a wide shot to capture the image of Myers on the roadway is intended to convey Laurie's point of view, and thus the audience sees him through her eyes. The teacher's monologue that can be heard in the soundtrack alludes to the fact that, much like Collins, Laurie is on a predetermined path that will culminate in her encounter with Myers. Fate caught up with several lives here. No matter what course of action William Collins took, he was destined to his own fate, his own day of reckoning. As the teacher concludes her lesson, Laurie once again glances out the classroom window to discover that Myers has vanished, insinuating that he is a manifestation of Laurie's imagination and sexual frustration. This scene lays the groundwork for the peculiar sexual bond between heroine and villain that will later be fulfilled through their violent interactions. Sexual repression is a pervasive theme in the slasher subgenre and functions as a consolidating force that connects the final girl and the killer. In these films, the villain is able to release his libidinal impulses through the ruthless act of unjustified murder. This savage behavior serves as a symbolic substitute for sexual intercourse, and thus the relationship between victim and killer is metaphorically consummated. This disturbing correlation between sex and death in the slasher film was noted by Robin Wood, who argued that the release of sexuality in the horror film is always presented as perverted, monstrous, and excessive. This accounts for the fact that the deaths of female victims in the slasher film tend to be particularly prominent and graphic in nature. Through their demise, the villain's female victims are quite literally transformed into the brides of death, who often keeps their mortal remains in his lair as trophies. These secondary characters are therefore of key importance in the narrative structure of the film, as they anticipate the villain's meeting with his final bride, the heroine, who is frequently a chaste female. This narrative structure is presented in A Nightmare on Elm Street, whereupon Freddy is posited as Nancy's perverted love interest, and their violent exchanges function as manifestations of their libidinal energy. Freddy is more overtly sexualized than Myers, and possesses a carnal appetite that is both insatiable and depraved, expressing his libido through sadistic acts of cruelty that often result in the death of his victims. In fulfilling this task, Freddy will posit his victim as a sexual object for his personal enjoyment, a dynamic that is particularly prevalent in relation to Nancy, since she is the central target. In an interview, the actor Robert Englund commented on this practice when he pointed out that by entering Nancy's dreams, as well as those of her peers, Krueger is able to violate his victim in an unprecedented fashion. Freddy's in those teenage girls' bedrooms. He's in their bed with them. That's more of a violation than rape. Freddy's preoccupation with Nancy is motivated by the fact that she possesses opposing psychological qualities and therefore represents his ideal adversary. The sexual battle in which they are engaged is therefore rooted in their archetypal properties, and Freddy's desire to murder Nancy is a manifestation of his longing to destroy her narratological role as a force of goodness within the community. In response, she struggles to protect herself and her peers from the destructive force of the villain and ensure a future for the citizens of Springwood. The strange sexual tension between Nancy and Krueger is one of the central driving forces behind A Nightmare on Elm Street, and becomes an increasingly conspicuous element as the film progresses. This theme is clearly implied during Nancy's fourth dream sequence, when she is attacked by Freddy while lying in a bathtub. As Nancy soaks in the warm water, Krueger's glove emerges from between her legs, directly juxtaposing the soft flesh of her thighs with the tarnished steel of Freddy's claws. Transforming the tub into a pit, Freddy grabs at her naked body and attempts to drag Nancy down to a watery grave. Douglas Rathgeb states that this scene is intended to imply that Nancy and Krueger are potential sex partners, and that they have somehow become compatible within the film's moral scheme. Indeed, as the film progresses, Freddy increasingly becomes the physical embodiment of Nancy's sexual frustrations and the nightmarish manifestation of her dream lover. This notion is revisited in a later scene, when Nancy tries to desperately contact Glenn via the telephone in order to save him from falling asleep and becoming another one of Freddy's victims. However, instead of reaching Glenn, Nancy hears Freddy's chilling voice on the other end of the line, telling her, "I'm your boyfriend now." The phone then partially morphs into a tongue, a manifestation of Freddy's dream power, and begins violently licking Nancy's lips. Commenting on this scene, Rathgeb argues that Krueger's objective is to become Nancy's dream lover, to legitimize sexually the union of their two rapidly converging worlds. Actress Heather Langenkamp, who played the role of Nancy, echoes these sentiments in an interview, stating that Nancy and Freddy's relationship has always had a sexual component. These strange and unsettling vignettes between Nancy and Freddy clearly illustrate the convergence of sex and violence in their relationship, which functions as the centerpiece of the film. Krueger's continued use of perverted sexual innuendo in his interactions with Nancy is rooted in the fact that she is his ideal foil and represents his ultimate challenge, both romantically and psychologically. The sexual link between the final girl and the villain reaches its culmination in the dramatic confrontation that generally occurs at the conclusion of the slasher film. The act of facing the killer marks a moment of transformation in the life of the female protagonist and symbolizes her graduation into adulthood. By confronting death, personified in the form of the villain, the heroine transitions into a state of consciousness, whereby she is aware of morbidity in the world. Much like the act of heterosexual intercourse and its potentially harrowing consequences, which includes the breaking of the hymen and the possibility of pregnancy, disease, and death, surviving her encounter with the villain signifies that she is no longer a child, but has become a woman. As Molly Haskell indicates, for heterosexual women, crossing the threshold into adulthood is a treacherous moment, as sexual penetration is more a terror than an opportunity. For the final girl, this rite of passage is experienced purely on the symbolic level, as the heroine and villain never consciously acknowledge the sexual implications of their actions, nor do they physically consummate their relationship. Instead, the violent interactions that they share function euphemistically to express their libidinal energy and externalize their sexual drives. According to Sue Short, by confronting the villain, the final girl embarks on a journey to acquire truth and identity, and along the way showcases her strength, ingenuity, and elevated sense of awareness. Clover supports Short's reading of the heroine's experience in the slasher film, explaining that when the final girl stands at last in the light of day with the knife in her hand, she has delivered herself into the adult world. As Short and Clover demonstrate, the curious and compassionate nature of these women may place them in peril, but it is also what leads them out of danger and transforms them into heroines. I agree with the observations of these scholars and argue that Newman's writings provide a psychological grounding for their insights. This encounter with death manifests in the form of a transgression. The slasher villain will either violate the heroine physically, as seen in Halloween, or on a psychological level, as displayed in A Nightmare on Elm Street. In the slasher film, the female protagonist is victimized by the villain, who attempts to sabotage her sense of selfhood and thereby annihilate her. The act of facing the killer symbolizes an encounter with death, and the final girl's ability to survive this experience is predicated on both her intellectual acumen as well as her physical agility. Through the appropriation and manipulation of the villain's weapon, she is able to externalize her sexual energy through acts of aggression and self-assertion. By defending herself and thwarting the killer's attacks, the final girl is able to reach psychological maturity and fulfill her potential. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up my presentation with a brief conclusion. After examining the psychological and philosophical role of the boogeyman in Western culture, we are left to wonder what the future holds for this mythic monster. His core function is to personify those potential dangers that threaten social order and jeopardize the harmony of the community. By exiling him, the public is symbolically cleansed of terrors concerning sin and death, allowing for a renewed sense of absolution. The boogeymen and other aberrant figures therefore offer us the opportunity to purify ourselves by transferring all of our worries and woes onto an imaginary being that can never be destroyed. Furthermore, due to the fact that the boogeyman embodies global anxieties related to torture, pain, and death, his continued role in the cultural imaginary is ensured for future generations. Perhaps instead of asking how to destroy the boogeyman, the more appropriate question is how to rid ourselves of the fear that he induces. The only true means by which this objective may be achieved is through the contemplation and self-discovery. Understanding our collective shadow involves acknowledging the inhumane aspects of our nature and the savagery that we are capable of perpetrating. This is an act of tremendous psychological courage and is the essential condition for any kind of wisdom and knowledge. As Robert Johnson explains, if we can learn to love the inner enemy, then there is a chance of loving and redeeming the outer one. However, he goes on to warn that projection is always easier than assimilation, and the temptation to blame others for our own inadequacies and flaws is great. The relevancy of monstrous and fantastical creatures such as the boogeyman is therefore a direct reflection of our own maturity and emotional intelligence. As long as the process of suppression and projection continues, men and women will forever need, and they will want, to make enemies, and their success in accomplishing this will be guaranteed. Until we are prepared to plumb the depths of our collective psyche and engage in the demanding process of introspection, the boogeyman will persist in the cultural imaginary. In a solipsistic process, we manufacture monsters, and believing we have no other recourse, we act by labeling such creatures as deviant and pernicious in order to protect ourselves. It is therefore simply a matter of time before the monstrous other reemerges in the public consciousness to terrify and thrill another audience. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. And that was a really lovely presentation. We will now open up our chat to any questions from our audience members. Morgan, just let me know if there are any questions. I did want to follow up while we wait from our virtual audience members with your closing remarks that made me even focus a bit deeper onto a question I wrote pretty early on in your presentation. And that was the question of, you talk about Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, not so much Friday the 13th, but that's the other franchise. And these had numerous sequels and even a cross-pollination between these franchises. What do you think about that? What, along the lines of your closing, what does that reveal about us as audience, that they're so successful that they have such extensive franchises?
Yeah, they're incredibly successful. No, it's a great point. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and I would say two things about that. The first thing I would say is that the more successfully a villain can embody the anxieties, fears, terrors of a particular community, be that a nation or a continent, however large or small it may be, I think the more successful the film franchise will be, because that commercial success means something. It means that yes, it's catering to the tastes of a particular audience, but it's also tapping into a psychological phenomena. And so I would argue that this is true of any kind of villainous figure, not necessarily even just the franchises that I'm referencing, but in any area of the horror genre. The more successfully that a villain or an antagonist can embody the kind of underbelly of society, if you like, the more successful the franchise is going to be on a commercial level. But Sean Cunningham, who was the director of Friday the 13th, actually, he wrote the preface to a book by Peter Bracke, and he's very articulate and talked about this. That if you watch the way that an audience responds to these films generally, there's a kind of almost schizophrenic response where one moment they're cheering for the villain, and then the next moment they're cheering for the heroine or the protagonist, whoever it might be. And but he talks about how eventually they always come back to the protagonist. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that these monsters, even though they're villainous and antagonistic and they do horrific acts, on some level they represent an aspect of our own psyche. And this is what I was really trying to get at with the my discussion of the collective shadow. I know it wasn't really featured in this particular presentation, but I talk about it a lot more in the book, that in many ways they're a sort of fantastical dramatization of our own inner monsters on a certain level, the impulses that we tend to repress in order to function within society. And both Newman and Eric Newman and another writer, Anthony Stevens, who was a biologist and a psychologist, talked about how the collective shadow is really created by the superego, that kind of internalized security guard, that what we might call your conscience, and that understanding of, okay, these certain acts are off limits. We cannot do this because A, we'll be incarcerated, and B, our friends and family will abandon us. You know, like they will see us. We will be alienated. It will result in some degree of social alienation, and when that fails to happen, when the superego is not successfully developed, or there isn't a kind of a sense of social responsibility, which we see in a lot of cases in sociopathic personalities, they take on these kind of monstrous attributes. And so I would argue that in many ways, these monstrous figures, again, the ones that are included in my book, but also other villainous figures from the horror genre, are really a projection of those violent, nefarious impulses that we have to repress in order to function within society, and also, you know, to ensure that we don't do something really horrific to other people. So that would be my answer to that question. I don't know if that entirely fulfilled it. I hope it did.
It did. It definitely did, because I'm also thinking about when much later on in the franchises, you get, is it Freddy meets Jason at one point, where there's a joining of the two in the one film, which is interesting because now it's almost like a Boogeyman club where these two different realms of the collective shadow, or these two different realms of the horrific imagination, are facing off against each other, and not so much against the quote unquote human victims, right?
It's an interesting phenomenon because it actually happens throughout the history of the horror genre. It actually, the same thing happened with the Universal monsters, that once those films kind of, I don't know how to phrase it, they sort of lost their ability to terrify. The next step was to start combining these figures in order to, I mean, from a commercial perspective, it was basically to kind of squeeze every last dime you could out of them. But I think on another level, that phenomena has a lot to do with, I mean, looking at it from a psychological perspective, if you look at the arc of the first cycle of slasher films, it really kind of comes to an end around the late 80s, early 90s. And that's when you start to see this kind of phenomenon where they're being matched up. You know, you're starting to see them sort of combining up and you know, meeting in certain films. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that as time goes on, the mystique, the fear, and the ability of these monsters to really encapsulate fears and anxiety start to dissipate. And again, I talk about a little bit about this in the book. I think that the rise and fall of these types of monstrous figures, specifically the Boogeyman, is very much tied into the socio-political sphere. I think that there are certain extrinsic circumstances, certain historical contexts that encourage the rise of this phenomena. And I specifically talk about how, you know, during the 1970s, it was a very you know, sexually adventurous period. It was sort of, you know, the kind of hangover, if you like, of the sexual revolution. It was very liberal parenting styles. And so you had a whole generation that, and you also had a huge influx in divorce rates. Divorce rates just skyrocketed. And so you had a lot of families that were being raised by single parents. and the rate of absentee fathers was enormous. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as you see the father receding within the family unit, you start to see cultural depictions of really awful, what I call the terrible father, start to emerge within American culture. Like, I don't think that's a coincidence that those two things are happening. But as you get into the 80s, you see a resurgence in conservatism, specifically in the form of the religious right in America, and also the election of Ronald Reagan. And this is true in England as well. You see the election of, or the rise of Margaret Thatcher, and this idea of conservative republicanism, and you see a much more sort of rigid parenting style starting to emerge, and it's that pendulum swinging back. And as that happens, I don't think it's a coincidence that you also see a dissipation in the slasher film cycle, and a dissipation of what I would call the boogeyman within the American culture. And so when that happens, these figures start to become increasingly figures of ridicule. They start to become more comedic in nature. They're being satirized. They're being parodied, and you especially see that. I mean, I thought Freddy versus Jason was actually a pretty good film. I was surprised. I kind of went into it very skeptical, but it's presenting them not necessarily as figures of terror, but instead almost as pastiche, or as figures of parody or camp, I guess would be a more appropriate term. And so that ability to terrify and to really properly embody the kind of underbelly of society, and those repressed psychological impulses really starts to subside. And I think that's also the reason why you see the kind of dissipation or subsiding of the original cycle of slasher films. They really start to they become increasingly or less, I should say, commercially successful as a direct correlation of this phenomena.
Yeah, definitely. There is that cycle and dissipation towards the end. And I like the point that you made. It becomes almost farcical.
Yeah.
When they start losing their scare factor, so to speak.
Absolutely, especially when you look at the A Nightmare on Elm Street series. I think more so than any other, there's, I mean, even in the first film, there was a slight element of camp, and that begins to increase exponentially with each successive film in the series. And almost every piece of literature you read from horror film scholars have talked about this, the fact that, as we get further and further into the 80s and the 90s, the sort of structure of the slasher becomes increasingly calcified and stereotyped, and you see that gore becomes an increasing element as opposed to any kind of psychological tension. It's depending more and more on blood and guts, and as a result of that, it begins to take on a kind of camp element. And I really think that that's one of the contributing factors that resulted in the death, basically, of the first slasher film cycle. It is eventually resurrected, no pun intended, as we into the 2000s. But, for, almost a decade there, it kind of really goes out of style.
Yeah. And we've talked quite a bit about the slasher film, which I'm always very happy to do. But I wanted to bring it, I know it wasn't part of your presentation today, but your book also talks about the fairy tale.
Yes.
Right? That you make this interesting connection from the Bluebeard fairy tale and moving those three, the collective shadow, the terrible father, the death demon, starting in this Bluebeard fairy tale, and you demonstrate a really interesting thread in moving it into the slasher film that we heard about today. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about those fairy tale roots.
Sure. Well, I love fairy tales, as I know you do as well. And part of the reason why I think they're so fascinating is because in some ways they're the original horror films.
Hmm.
And conversely, horror films are contemporary fairy tales. And what I mean by that is there's really two scholars who I thought were very, very helpful, or two theorists, I should say. And the first was Mary Louise von Franz, and the second was Mikita Brotman. And they talk about fairy tales in two different ways. Mary Louise von Franz talks about the kind of narratological aspects of fairy tales, and then Mikita Brotman talks about the psychological facets. And Mary Louise von Franz said something that I thought was really brilliant. She said that fairy tales are the clearest illustration of the archetype in the sense that they're universal. they're they have a kind of stock cast of characters. They're usually very one-dimensional, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I think that's actually one of the biggest assets of the fairy tale, because they're so generic that they cross all cultural, political, national boundaries. And so what she was trying to emphasize when she said that was that, these stories are a direct reflection. They're kind of ethnographic in a lot of ways, because they articulate exactly what's going on just beneath the surface in a particular culture. And Mikita Brotman, although she doesn't directly reference von Franz, she's sort of invoking a similar idea when she says that horror films serve the same or a very similar psychological purpose to fairy tales, in that both of them act as a kind of primer. Fairy tales were really, um, I mean, when they're eventually transcribed and written down, they start to be tailored more and more for a kind of juvenile audience. There's a famous name for this, Zobermärchen, and it's basically like fantasy stories, and they're designed to kind of appeal to a young audience because of these fantastical elements, but they're also preparing them for the dangers of the world, really, and particularly the sexual dangers, especially when you get into stories about young women like Beauty and the Beast, or uh, um, certainly in the case of Snow White. It's warning young girls about, like, okay, and Donkey Skin is another great example. Like,
Yeah.
there are dangers out there that you need to be prepared for. And um, and so horror films, in an interesting way, sort of serve, I think, a very similar function, particularly the slasher film. That, it's not a coincidence that almost the entire cast of all of these films and their subsequent sequels are teenagers,
Mhm.
usually on the precipice of adulthood, and they're usually, you know, sexuality and drug taking are usually pretty prevalent themes. We see them in almost all of these films, and so the antagonists of these films really serve a similar function to most of the villains of fairy tales, in that they serve as kind of cautionary function. They're warning young children about the dangers of illicit activities. I specifically chose Bluebeard as the kind of template for the boogeyman, because I he's an elusive figure. It's really tough to talk about the boogeyman because it's not really a specific character per se. It's more of a type of character, a concept. And so I really leaned very heavily on the writings of Marina Warner, who's a great, she's oftentimes categorized as either a historian or a literary analyst, but I would really call her more a mythographer, because she really looks at the expanse of literature written around a particular type of character, and then tries to pull together a kind of cohesive criteria or definition. And so I was pulling from her literature, specifically a book she wrote called No Go the Boogeyman. And it was really helpful in trying to carve out a definition for, what is the boogeyman? What are we talking about here? And when I looked at the key characteristics that she outlined, the clearest template for this character was really Bluebeard, because, you know, he was violent, he was sadistic, he was a loner, he had sociopathic traits, and he was also, you know, at least according to Charles Perrault, ugly, you know, hideous to look at. And that's another key characteristic that we see both in the fairy tale and in the horror film, is that this relationship between external and internal ugliness, that they function very much as a mirror of one another. And in the story of Bluebeard, for anybody who's not familiar, it's the story of a homicidal bridegroom who marries and then murders a series of young women. And then his final bride, who's later named Fatima, is able to basically outwit him, and either, in most versions, I should say, including Charles Perrault's version, she is able to call upon her brothers to come and kill Bluebeard, and then she has this happy ending where she inherits his wealth and his kingdom. And so, in many ways, a lot of the conventions that are laid out in the story of Bluebeard are very much reiterated in the contemporary slasher film, and it's almost startling how similar these narrative structures actually are. And in fact, Anna Biller, a pretty well-known independent filmmaker, even comments on this in an article she wrote, that, you know, these stories are about a young woman whose friends, who also happen to be female, are usually murdered, and she's going into this unknown place, discovering secrets about this villainous male figure. And so sexuality, which is very much a key theme in Bluebeard, we see that reiterated in the slasher film. These stories there's a very strong psychosexual component to them. And in fact, Bruno Bettelheim, who's sort of a contentious figure, we can talk more about him later, but he wrote a really brilliant book called, I think, really brilliant, Uses of Enchantment, which is, he takes a lot of Freud's ideas and he applies them to fairy tales, including Little Red Cap, Cinderella, and Bluebeard. And in it, he talks about how at the conclusion of this story, Fatima goes into this secret chamber of her husband, Bluebeard, and discovers the dead bodies of his previous wives. And that this bloody chamber is really a metaphor for the potential dangers for a young woman when she enters into the adult world of, you know, human sexuality. And that was one of the most interesting aspects of it. It's both, and it's an interesting dichotomy, because on the one hand, there are misogynistic components to it, and at the same time, it's very, for lack of a better term, feminist, because she's the heroine and she has a happy ending. So it's you know, there's an interesting, and I find this a lot in the slasher films as well. The depiction of women and womanhood is very interesting, because it's sort of a double-edged sword. You know, both are operating at the same time. It's both, we both get, you know, the heroine is a very positive depiction of womanhood, but she's also a chaste virgin. So it's like, you can't, you know, is this positive? Is this good? Is this bad? So it's that's kind of where the book essentially leaves off, is what is this really saying about our society? So I know that was a little long-winded, sorry.
No, and it's an interesting component, because many would read the title of your book and say, how from fairy tale to slasher do we see this transition, this migration? And it very much comes back down to our stories keep changing as we change, as a society, as human beings. And our monsters, like you said earlier, they reflect what we don't want to see in ourselves. And there's this cathartic feeling of being in the safe space of watching a film like this, of reading a scary story like this, but you can safely say, oh, that's just in my imagination. It can't possibly happen. But we know that it can happen. And you just brought up in Bluebeard the idea of the sociopath. This idea, well, Bluebeard in some stories isn't attractive, but in some he sort of is attractive. And it made me think of this current trend of almost not documentary, but docudrama of rehashing serial killer stories. We had it with the Dahmer series and Ted Bundy series, and I think even the Gacy story. But even I remember one of the pushbacks that came, especially with the Ted Bundy story, was casting of Zac Efron. But really, it encapsulates what the problem with Ted Bundy was, which was he was good looking. He looked like the boy next door. He was very friendly. And sometimes, and I think we've chatted about this in other occasions, that sometimes the real monster wears the mask of humanity.
Absolutely. It's interesting you bring this up because, I find it kind of interesting but unsettling at the same time, because I actually originally, very early on when I was writing this book, there was actually a whole section where I discussed the idea of the serial killer as a parallel to the boogeyman in popular culture. And it's fascinating. I mean, when you look at, for example, one of the figures that I studied in detail was a man named Albert Fish. And it's one of the most gruesome stories from American crime history. He was a serial killer of children, a pedophile, and a cannibal. And it was really, truly horrific. And he was oftentimes referred to as the boogeyman, or as I think he was called the 64-year-old ogre in by certain newspaper outlets. But there was a whole series of monikers that he had. And he was, I think, rightfully vilified when he was captured. But it was interesting to contrast that with how certain serial killers, as you pointed out, like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer quite recently, are being portrayed within popular culture. I always remember listening to an interview with Joe Stefano, I think was his name, who was the screenwriter of Psycho.
Oh.
And he actually, because Psycho, the book written by Robert Bloch, was very loosely based on the story of Ed Gein, who was a serial killer who lived in Wisconsin. I believe he was captured in the 1950s or 60s, if I'm not mistaken. And in Robert Bloch's book, the character of Norman Bates looked nothing like Anthony Perkins. He was actually he was older, he was in his 50s, he was overweight, he was bald. And Joe Stefano, when he was writing the script for Psycho, significantly altered this character intentionally. He created a character who looked very much like Anthony Perkins, young, attractive, charismatic, disturbed, but very much good looking. And he did that intentionally in order to, and this is how he put it, in order to elicit the sympathy of the audience. And that's part of what makes Psycho so powerful, is that, how could this young, good-looking, sweet young boy be, not only a serial killer, but, basically completely psychotic. He's adopted the persona of his own mother. And this is why I find what you're talking about so disturbing, because we are a society that first of all, we're visual creatures. And I think we're living in an age that particularly is more there's a term for this. It's the term that's oftentimes used is scopophilia, and scopophilia is this idea of like it's literally the pleasure of looking. We are a society that thrives on images. Our social media is obsessed with images. We're constantly taking photographs, posting them. We see thousands of images every single day. We love them. We crave them, and the fetishization of images and the idea of creating attractive or appealing personae for individuals who have done horrific acts, I do find it very disturbing. I think the only exception I would have to this would be something like American Psycho, where it's used in a very smart, subversive way. You know, Patrick Bateman, played by Christian Bale, is very attractive physically, but he's a pathetic character, first of all, and that attractiveness is very clearly depicted within the film as just that, a mask, and there is nothing beyond that. It's that film is really addressing not only the superficiality of the 80s, but also that idea of the emptiness and the vacuousness that exists beyond the psychopathic or sociopathic personality. But I think that this is part of the reason, and I know we've talked about this before, that I have a lot of reservations about the dramatization of real life events, particularly related to serial killers, because inevitably, when a filmmaker wishes to, if a filmmaker wishes to elicit sympathy for a antagonistic figure, not necessarily a villain, but an antagonistic figure, it is oftentimes necessary to take certain creative licenses. And I know we've talked about this figure before, but Aileen Wuornos in Monster, I think that's a brilliant film,
Yes.
but it's very evident that certain liberties have been taken in terms of the events around the killings that she perpetrated and her eventual arrest, with a very specific intent. The director is trying to make a social commentary. I'm very uneasy about it. I guess I know that's not a really clear answer, but
I have to say I've seen the Dahmer one, and I did watch the Ted Bundy one, and I'm very similar along the same lines as you. It's a very tricky line for a director or a writer, even the actor, to walk when you're dealing with real historical events. What preoccupies me even beyond that, and this came up with the Dahmer release, a lot of the survivors' a lot of the victims' families are still alive, and having to watch this is a re-victimization, a re-traumatization of the victims' families for profit, which, where is this money going? And it just takes the conversation even a step further, because it becomes, he's the antagonist of the series. And yet, again, the victims are re-victimized because they remain dehumanized.
yeah, I remember I watched an interview with Isabella Rossellini, and I mean, not only is she a very talented actress and director, but she was married to Martin Scorsese. And she talked about how more so than in any other art form, the forces of creativity and commerce are brought into direct conflict when it comes to film and, you know, any kind of TV as well, or streaming. And so there's that tension of satisfying an audience's desires and wishes, but at the same time maintaining a certain level of creative integrity. And you know, I think the same, I would say the same thing about even the series of Ryan Murphy's series of, famous trials, the Menendez brothers, the O.J. Simpson trial. This same idea of, yes, it's a dramatization, but there are definite creative liberties. There are elements that are being left out. Any filmmaker who's going to dramatize a true event has to make certain creative choices in order to have a kind of clear directive and a clear agenda. But I do feel very uneasy because I think in certain cases it really is unethical. You really are, or I should say the filmmakers in some of these cases are really treading a very fine line where they are starting to glamorize and venerate figures that have done things that are really egregious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I really, my own personal feeling is I think documentaries are more the appropriate avenue to take in those cases because there's less choices. There's less, you're not allowed the same sort of creative liberties when it comes to a documentary. Yes, you're still making choices, but the facts that you're presenting have to be reflective of the reality of what happened. And so I tend to recoil from them. It's interesting. I remember, I can't remember exactly what theorist or what scholar I was reading, but they were talking about killers in films, going back all the way to Fritz Lang's M. And oftentimes when we see killers in films from previous generations, they will have some sort of physical defect. And this was a means of communicating to the audience, this is not the person to root for. Something is wrong here, that the external is somehow reflective of the internal. And this goes back to Margaret Shildrick as well. Like, external monstrosity is oftentimes used as a metaphor for internal monstrosity. Because again, we're visual creatures. We understand this. When we see someone with some sort of defect, on film at least, we interpret that as someone who is bad or sinful or morally questionable. And we even see this within society in previous generations. It's instinctive almost. We see that less and less and less as time goes on. And I oftentimes wonder, what is this reflective of? What does this mean in terms of the broader social landscape? What does it mean in terms of our collective understanding of what monstrosity is? And what does this mean in terms of our perception of serial killers and psychopathic personality types? Yeah, it's really kind of disturbing.
It is, because you start, again, the physicality of the monster that does not look human, that the freak show, the physically abnormal delineates right off the bat the visual. There's something wrong. And now that sometimes the real monsters look like us, talk like us, and are more monstrous than the monsters that look monstrous, that are physically monstrous. It's disturbing, and this is where it's not as clean cut as you said.
No, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, that's where I think the kind of I mean, I don't mean this as a criticism of slasher films in any way, but the kind of generic nature of them, the very kind of basic delineation between good and evil, those stock characters, the idea that the villain is ugly, the heroine or protagonist is beautiful, that's really one of its strengths because it is so clear cut. But you're right. And again, I would go back to a film that I referenced earlier, American Psycho. That's probably part of why it is such a disturbing film, because Christian Bale is such a good-looking actor. And again, I think that film, I think, is it's done in in a very responsible manner, I guess is the best way to put it. And I know that there were a lot of creative liberties taken when it was adapted from the book to the screen. The book, from what I'll be honest with you, I have not read it, but it is almost pornographic in terms of its depiction of violence. It's quite graphic, very unlike the film. And the director, who was a woman, actually chose to make Patrick Bateman a kind of pathetic figure at the end, that this is somebody who is truly psychotic. And so from my perspective, the statement of the film is exactly reflective of what you just said, that these are not figures to venerate or to idolize. In fact, they're figures to pity. And I think that's very much reflective of what happens in society. You know, the truth is that most criminals have lower IQ. They're not Hannibal Lecter. They're not super geniuses. They've actually led pretty pitiful lives in a lot of cases. They're usually subject to sexual abuse. They're usually had very tumultuous upbringings. They've usually been subject to a great deal of torment, and that actually contributes to their psychosis. What worries me is exactly what you said, the glamorization of it, without any kind of understanding of the deeper meaning of that glamorization. You know, presenting someone as accessible or vulnerable, but without an understanding of why. That's what concerns me.
Yeah,
so
it turns it back onto the audience, if we continue speaking about the film genres, to develop critical media knowledge in these cases. So on that note, I was wondering if you wanted to leave any last thoughts for our own audience on some takeaways that you would leave with us.
Well, I think that you know what, the whole reason that I really began the thesis and decided to adapt it into the book was because I'm really interested in the nature of fear, for lack of a better phrase. You know, what is it that triggers us? What is it? And what I found astounding in doing a lot of this research was that these fears are essentially universal. They cross all boundaries, and I think that's why once and this is why you know, this book in some ways is a thoroughly un-postmodern book. Not intentionally. That was not. It wasn't intended to be antagonistic towards it. But in terms of its structure, its approach, the questions it's asking, it's really looking at the commonalities as opposed to the disparities or the discrepancies. And that's what I found so interesting, was that these fears seem to cross all boundaries, and the complexities or the issues that are intergenerational, because these figures are representative of things that, you know, as you so often point out, the personal is political, the political is personal. I would argue the same is true with culture. You know, what happens within one's personal life eventually trickles out into the culture. And so the intergenerational relationships between parents and children, not just mothers, but also fathers, and how that manifests in the broader culture, because I think in many ways the phenomenon of the boogeyman has to do with the relationship between children and fathers. I think a lot of it has to do with that. Parental figures, yes, but specifically fathers. And that I found really fascinating, that there is a yearning, I think, and this is what the eventual conclusion that I came to, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of why this original slasher cycle came into existence. There is a yearning for a kind of guiding paternalistic force, whether that is a male figure or not. There is a yearning to have some force within one's life, particularly early on, to you know, hopefully lovingly and with compassion, impose parameters because if those parameters are not imposed, it eventually manifests in a perverted form. And that's what I would argue, that these horrific figures are in many ways the symbolic father that was absent from a lot of young children's lives. And that's why he's constantly imposing these awful punishments on these children, because the audience is yearning for that. But that yearning takes on a kind of distorted, perverted form when it's projected into the culture. And so for me, that was the big takeaway, was that if there are problems or disturbances within people's private lives, eventually they will grow, expand, and manifest within the broader collective. And I'm sure I don't mean to speak for you here, but I'm sure that you've probably found that as well in your own research, because you spent a lot more time than me studying monstrosity and monsters. So
it's nice to hear about it flipping up back onto the father and not always blaming the mother. So I welcome further scholarship on the terrible father. Kevin, it's been, like always, a pleasure to hear your thoughts and how your work has grown, and congratulations again on the publication of the book. And thank you for joining us today to talk about it and moving ahead beyond the book, it seems, with new thoughts and ideas. So again, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. I couldn't have done it without you. There's no way. It wouldn't have been possible.
Well, we're always very available to talk about monsters, and it was a pleasure, and it continues to be a pleasure to collaborate with you. And I'd like to thank all our audience who joined us here today. Thank you, Morgan, for helping out. And we will see you next year, 2025, I believe. I have something in the works for March. So thank you, everybody.